May 7, 1945. Bremen, Northern Germany. A battered U.S. Army Jeep lurches past the smoking carcasses of Wehrmacht trucks on a muddy road carved through rubble and ash. In the back, hunched against the drizzle, sit 5 German women in soiled auxiliary uniforms, clutching their meager belongings: leather satchels, a tin cup, folded blankets stained with the dirt of retreat. They are not soldiers, not exactly. They are Helferinnen, members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and something harder to name: a stubborn, bone-deep pride that refuses to dissolve even as their right crumbles around them. One woman still wears a cracked monocle perched precariously on her nose. Another clutches a leather-bound edition of Goethe against her chest like a shield. Within 48 hours, these educated daughters of the Third Reich would face their most humiliating surrender, not to American firepower, not to occupation, but to a dented tin pot of Cowboy coffee brewed by a grinning Texan who didn't even use a filter. By May 1945, the Wehrmacht was dissolving like salt in rain. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12, and now it was melting into the mud of a German spring. Over 11 million German prisoners of war would be captured by the Allies before summer, the largest mass surrender in human history. Among them, approximately 500,000 were women serving in auxiliary roles. They were the invisible scaffolding of the Nazi war machine, communications specialists who had relayed orders across collapsing fronts, administrative staff who had filed the Reich's meticulous paperwork until there was nothing left to file, nurses who had bandaged wounds that no amount of gauze could heal. Many were educated, middle-class women, school teachers pulled from classrooms, university students who had traded textbooks for typewriters, office workers who had believed in order and efficiency right up until the moment order became chaos. These were women raised in a culture that prided itself on culture, on sophistication, on doing things the proper way. Germany had given the world Goethe and Beethoven, after all. It had given the world philosophy and precision engineering. And it had given the world a very particular way of drinking coffee. Bremen was a shattered port city by that May, converging point for British and American forces who swept through northern Germany like a tide washing over sandcastles. The city's famous medieval center, the Roland statue, the ornate town hall, stood somehow intact amid the ruins, a strange monument to what had been. But surrounding it was devastation. Entire neighborhoods reduced to skeletal walls, factories bombed into twisted metal sculptures, the harbor choked with sunken ships. And everywhere, prisoners. Temporary POW processing camps were springing up in commandeered warehouses, in open fields, in any space that could hold human beings behind wire. The chaos of sorting millions of people, soldiers and civilians and collaborators and refugees, all jumbled together in the collapse, defied comprehension. Where does one category end and another begin when an entire society has imploded? The coffee culture divide between conquerors and conquered was a chasm as wide as the Atlantic itself. For Germans, coffee was civilization itself. Proper filtered coffee, Filterkaffee*, served in porcelain cups, consumed during the afternoon ritual of Kaffeeklatsch where women gathered to discuss literature and gossip and the affairs of the day. Germany's coffee culture stretched back to the 17th century, when coffeehouses became intellectual salons where Enlightenment ideas percolated alongside the dark brew. Coffee meant order, meant refinement, meant there was still structure to the world. American GIs, on the other hand, drank coffee the way they fought wars. Quick, efficient, and without ceremony. Instant coffee from packets. Cowboy brews boiled in whatever container was handy. Coffee was fuel, nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't supposed to be an experience. It was supposed to wake you up and keep you moving. Enter Corporal James Buck Hendricks, 23 years old, born and raised in Amarillo, Texas. He was 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, and he had rolled across France and into Germany brewing coffee the only way he knew how, grounds dumped directly into a tin pot, boiled over whatever fire he could build, strained through nothing but optimism and a tin cup. He had grown up on ranch coffee, the kind made over mesquite fires during cattle drives, the kind that could strip paint if you let it sit too long. Years later, in a 2nd Armored Division newsletter, someone would quote him saying, "Coffee ain't supposed to be fancy. It's supposed to wake you up and keep you warm. Everything else is just decoration." The processing camp sat in a converted factory warehouse 15 miles outside Bremen, hastily ringed with wire fencing and guard towers that seemed almost apologetic in their construction. Inside, rows of confused prisoners sat on the concrete floor or milled about in anxious clusters, trying to understand what came next. There was a shortage of everything: food, medicine, translators, patience, hope. The war was over, but the world hadn't yet figured out what peace looked like. And here was the great irony that would have made a philosopher laugh. Germany had just lost the most mechanized, technologically advanced war in human history. They had built rockets that touched space, tanks that revolutionized warfare, encryption machines of staggering complexity. But it would be coffee, simple, humble coffee, that became the front line of cultural superiority. The battlefield where the last fragments of German pride would make their final, futile stand against the reality of defeat, one bitter cup at a time. The morning of May 9, 1945, arrived cold and gray, dawn mist rolling across the muddy camp like a ghost reluctant to leave. Corporal Buck Hendricks squatted by a small fire he'd built from scrap wood, swirling coffee grounds directly into a blackened pot that had seen more of Europe than most tourists ever would. The smell rose thick and bitter, unmistakably American, bold enough to cut through the diesel fumes and the lingering stench of defeat that hung over everything. He stirred the pot with a stick, watching the grounds dance in the boiling water, content in the simple ritual that connected him to home, to normalcy, to mornings when the worst thing you worried about was whether the coffee was strong enough. On the other side of the wire fence, the German women watched with expressions that ranged from confusion to visible disgust. Hauptfeldherrin Margarethe Wolf, 34 years old, former schoolteacher from Hamburg with impeccable posture despite 3 days of captivity, leaned toward her companions and spoke in sharp German. "Sie erwarten von uns, das wir das trinken? Das ist Tierfutter." They expect us to drink that? That's animal feed. Laughter rippled through the small group, nervous laughter, defiant laughter, the kind that clings to dignity even when dignity has become an expensive luxury. One woman actually spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt that would have meant something more in another time, another context. Buck approached the fence carrying tin cups, the coffee sloshing dark and hot. He offered them through the wire with a smile that was neither mocking nor pitying, just matter-of-fact. The women turned away as if he'd offered them poison. One pulled her threadbare coat tighter and muttered something that didn't require translation. Historical records from POW regulations were clear. Captors were required to provide humane treatment, but nowhere in the Geneva Convention did it specify the brewing method for coffee. Buck shrugged, a movement that said more than words could, poured himself a cup, and returned to his fire. He'd made the offer. What they did with it was their choice. Lieutenant Morrison, Buck's commanding officer, observed the exchange from across the compound and later noted in the 2nd Armored Division's after-action reports, now preserved in the National Archives under Record Group 407. "The Kraut women acted like we were serving them poison." Hendricks just laughed and drank it himself. Cultural differences make for strange standoffs. The waiting game began in earnest. May 9th became May 10th, then May 11th. The processing camp stretched at its seams with more prisoners arriving daily, and rations that were already thin became thinner still. The official Red Cross standard mandated 1,500 calories per day for prisoners of war, but in the chaos of Germany's collapse, such numbers were aspirational at best. Reality meant thin soup that was more water than substance, hard bread that could break teeth, occasional canned meat of indeterminate origin. And no coffee, not for the German prisoners, anyway. Except for Buck's standing offer, which remained unclaimed like an insult neither side would acknowledge. But every morning, that smell. It wafted across the compound with the reliability of sunrise, a sensory assault that grew harder to ignore with each passing day. The German women, coffee deprived for weeks already, German supplies had collapsed in March, and even ersatz substitutes had become scarce, began to weaken in ways that had nothing to do with calories. Coffee had been rationed in Germany since 1939. By 1945, what passed for coffee was made from roasted acorns, from barley, from chicory, from anything that could be burned dark and pretended to be what it wasn't. These women hadn't tasted real coffee in months, perhaps years. The aroma was maddening. Ilse Schmidt, 26, who kept a diary throughout her captivity that would later be published in the 1983 memoir collection Trümmerfrauen, wrote on May 11, "The smell was maddening. It smelled like insult and survival mixed together. Every morning it reminds us of what we were and what we have become. I hate it. I cannot stop thinking about it." Buck wasn't engaged in psychological warfare. He was simply a man who loved his coffee and brewed it the way his grandfather had taught him on the ranch. But the effect was undeniable. The unintentional torture of desire, of need colliding with pride. Historical context mattered here. These were women who had once sat in elegant cafes discussing Rilke over properly filtered filter coffee served in porcelain cups. Now they stood behind wire, watching a cowboy boil grounds in a dented pot, and their stomachs betrayed their dignity with every inhalation. May 12, 1945. Morning. Cold drizzle turned the camp into a landscape of gray mud and grayer faces. Margarethe Wolf approached the fence with the careful steps of someone making a decision they couldn't take back. She didn't make eye contact. Her English was stiff, formal, each word costing something, perhaps 1 cup. To evaluate its quality. Buck looked up from his pot, his grin slow and knowing but not cruel. According to company legend, the kind of story that gets repeated in mess halls and eventually takes on the weight of scripture, he replied, "Well, ma'am, I don't think it'll pass your German inspection, but it's hot and it's strong." 5 women gathered around the shared cups, hands trembling slightly from cold or hunger or something else entirely. The first sip brought grimaces, visible disgust. It was everything they'd feared. Coarse, bitter, barbaric. The second sip brought pause, consideration. It was also hot, real, undeniably coffee. The third sip came with hands wrapped around warm tin, steam rising into their faces, and something that looked almost like surrender. Silence fell over the small group. One woman muttered under her breath, "Es ist barbarisch, aber es funktioniert." It's barbaric, but it works. Buck overheard, his German better than he let on. His grin widened. "Ma'am, where I come from, that's a compliment." The daily ritual began with the reliability of a ceasefire that both sides had quietly agreed to honor. May 13th through May 20th, every morning, the same women returned to the fence. No more mockery, no more theatrical disgust, just quiet gratitude wrapped in the dignified silence of people who had learned that survival requires flexibility. Buck brewed extra, pouring without comment, and they drank without speaking. Fraternization between American soldiers and German prisoners was officially discouraged. The war might be over, but the wounds were still open and bleeding. Yet sharing coffee occupied a gray area that nobody seemed inclined to clarify. What harm could come from hot liquid and human decency? What the coffee represented went deeper than caffeine or warmth. It wasn't surrender to American culture, not exactly. It was acknowledgement of a harder truth. The war was over, and pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. These women had refused American cigarettes when offered, had turned away from American chocolate, symbols too obvious, too loaded with the weight of conquest. But coffee, that primal comfort that transcended nationality, that broke through defenses because it spoke to something more fundamental than ideology. It was the first admission that they were no longer auxiliary personnel of the Third Reich. They were simply human beings who were cold and tired and trying to figure out how to keep existing. In a 1967 interview conducted as part of a German oral history project documenting women's experiences in World War II, Margarethe Wolf, by then a retired schoolteacher living in a rebuilt Hamburg, reflected, "That Texas cowboy's terrible coffee taught me more about survival than 4 years of war. We had been raised to believe that how you did things mattered as much as what you did. That form was inseparable from function. That there was a right way and a wrong way, and the wrong way was beneath us. His coffee was wrong in every technical sense. And yet it was right in the only sense that mattered in that moment. Sometimes what keeps you alive isn't elegant. It just is. Buck himself, interviewed decades later for a 1978 VFW magazine feature on forgotten moments of the war, seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. I didn't think much of it at the time. They were cold, we had coffee. Simple as that. War's over, might as well be human about it. My grandfather used to say that coffee's only job is to help you face another day. Doesn't matter if it's pretty. This scene, this small transaction across a wire fence in a forgotten processing camp outside Bremen, repeated itself across Germany in May 1945 with endless variations. Americans brought practicality, efficiency, a kind of optimistic pragmatism that assumed yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's something else. Germans brought shattered pride, meticulous cultural memory, and the desperate need to believe that some part of who they had been could survive what they had become. And in the spaces between, in the sharing of cigarettes and chocolate and especially coffee, the earliest, most tentative forms of peace began to take shape. By June 1945, the numbers were staggering: 7.6 million German prisoners of war in Allied hands, the largest mass captivity in human history. Women constituted roughly 7% of that total, 500,000 souls trying to navigate a world that had no clear category for them. Were they war criminals? Victims? Collaborators? The answer depended on who was asking and what they wanted to hear. Conditions in POW camps varied wildly across the occupied zones. Some camps operated with relative humanity, commanders who understood that small dignities, decent food, medical care, the occasional cup of real coffee, made processing easier and prevented the kind of resentment that could poison a peace. Other camps were nightmarish, overcrowded pens where disease and starvation killed thousands. The Bremen camp fell somewhere in the middle, leaning toward decent thanks partly to officers like Lieutenant Morrison who valued small courtesies, who understood that the war was over and vengeance was expensive. Food historian Rachel Lawton would later note in her research on post-war Europe, food sharing between captors and captives was technically prohibited under the informal protocols of occupation, but rarely enforced for minor items like coffee or cigarettes. These small exchanges became the earliest forms of post-war reconciliation, more effective than any treaty because they operated at the human scale where forgiveness is actually possible. The contrast with the Soviet sector was stark and terrible. German prisoners in the East received no such courtesies. Hundreds of thousands died in Soviet captivity, worked to death in labor camps, or simply forgotten in the vast machinery of Stalin's retribution. The small mercies of American coffee never made it past the Elbe River. The cultural aftermath rippled for decades. Post-war Germany saw American coffee culture flood in alongside Marshall Plan aid and Coca-Cola. By the 1950s, traditional filter cafes still dominated German homes, but the Americano style grew in popularity, especially among younger Germans who associated it with modernity, with the future, with putting the past behind them. The Helferinnen generation carried more complex memories, defeat and coffee intertwined in ways they couldn't quite separate, that bitter brew becoming a symbol of the moment when everything they had believed revealed itself as sand. There's a particular irony that any German today would appreciate. In the 21st century, Germans routinely mock American coffee as weak, dishwater, a pale imitation of proper European brewing. German baristas take pride in their craft, their precision, their refusal to compromise quality for convenience. But in 1945, that same American coffee, coarse and strong and made without any ceremony whatsoever, was liquid dignity. It was the difference between holding on to humanity and losing it entirely. May 22, 1945. The processing camp prepared to close, prisoners transferred to British sector facilities for further sorting and eventual release. Buck brewed one last pot as the women gathered their few belongings. Margarethe approached the fence a final time, accepted a cup, and nodded with something that almost resembled respect. No words were exchanged because none were needed. Some conversations happen entirely in gesture and silence.